Hello, friends and explorers in pursuit of humanity's most fundamental food source. Today, we'll focus on the history of bread, which first sparked in the deserts of Jordan 14,000 years ago, long before the agricultural revolution. From that first magical scent of wild grains, crushed between stones and met by fire, to the ancient Egyptian bakeries and the Roman squares where free bread was distributed, we'll witness how this food has held societies together. What's your earliest memory of bread? I always enjoy reading your comments. Bread is one of the oldest prepared foods in human history. It predates written language. It predates the wheel. And in many ways, it predates what we would even call civilization. The story of bread is a story of people, of places, of patience, and of processes that have endured through thousands of years. As long as people have gathered around fires, there has been a form of bread slowly baking on hot stones or clay. Its aroma is not just familiar, it is ancient. It links generations and civilizations across time, across borders, across beliefs. When we think of bread, we may picture something as simple as a slice on a plate. But what lies behind that simple image is a vast history of invention, discovery, ritual, and necessity. Before agriculture existed, before cities rose, and long before anyone kept time or wrote down laws, humans collected wild grains and crushed them with rocks. They added water, creating pastel-like mixtures, which were then dried or heated. This early proto-bread was more survival than cuisine, more sustenance than delight. But it was a beginning. Over millennia, these primitive mixtures would evolve into flatbreads, into sourdoughs, into loaves with structure, with crust, with crumb. And with each stage, humanity advanced alongside its staple. Bread was not just food. It was currency. It was offering. It was power. It was something to be shared, but also something to be fought over. The presence or absence of bread often determined who would thrive and who would struggle. Every major turning point in human civilization has had bread in the background. The agricultural revolution gave us the wheat and barley we needed to settle and plant. Ancient empires used bread to feed their laborers and soldiers. Religion and culture elevated bread from mere nourishment to sacred symbol. The rise and fall of grain prices has sparked revolutions and redefined economies. And through it all, whether rustic or refined, bread has been constant. When we say someone earns their daily bread, we are echoing a truth older than language itself. Bread is labor made edible. It is time made tangible. It is memory you can taste. To introduce the history of bread is to accept that we are stepping into an endless timeline. There is no single point of origin, no single inventor, no perfect recipe that marked the beginning. Instead, there are scattered discoveries, regional variations, and incremental improvements that stretch back into the shadowy past. Archaeological evidence gives us glimpses, charred crumbs in ancient ovens, grinding stones worn smooth by repeated use, burial goods shaped like loaves, all point to a truth we already feel in our bones. Bread has always been with us. In the warmth of a bakery, in the ash of a fire pit, in the offering placed beside a king or buried with a laborer, bread is there. And this presence of bread through history is not just physical, it is emotional. The smell of baking bread can trigger memories, can calm nerves, can make a house feel like a home. There is something deeply human in that aroma, something ancestral, something older than words. This introduction is not merely a summary of what is to come, but an invitation to slow down and observe the small, meaningful details of how bread connects us to the past. Every chapter in the history of bread holds not just facts and timelines, but textures, rituals, and quiet moments. As we begin this slow journey through grains and grinds, ovens and hands, we will not hurry. Bread is patient. It rises in its own time. So too will this story. There is no need for haste. We will visit Egypt's tombs and Roman bakeries. We will wander through medieval villages and industrial bakeries. We will pause with peasants and kings, with monks and merchants, each holding bread in their own way. What we are about to unfold is not just culinary history, it is a mirror of who we are. And so we begin, not with urgency, but with warmth. The same warmth that has risen with every loaf throughout human time. The aroma of history is all around us. It begins with bread. Before bread, as we know it, could exist. Before ovens and recipes and leavening, there were only grains and the quiet persistence of early humans learning to survive. The story begins not with a baker, but with a gatherer kneeling in a field of wild grasses, slowly collecting seed heads between their fingers under the wide sky. These early grains were not cultivated, and they did not grow in neat rows. They were scattered by nature, resilient but inconsistent, clinging to the earth and requiring patience to find. Among these grasses, the most important were wild Iran and Emma wheat, to humble ancestors of the modern cereal crops we know today. The act of gathering them was laborious and slow. The seeds were small and easily lost. They required drying and careful storage, but they were dense with nutrients and could be ground into paste when mixed with water. That paste, thick and sticky, was the very first shadow of what we would one day call dough. It was not baked in any oven. Instead, it was spread onto flat stones, warmed by the sun or held over fire, where the heat would dry the mixture into something that could be chewed and digested. These early flatbreads were not fluffy or flavorful. They were tough and bland, but they were portable and filling. They offered energy and a sense of fullness that raw grains could not provide. In this small but important innovation, early humans found a way to preserve their harvest and carry their food across great distances. These first breads were not meals to be enjoyed. They were tools for survival. With each season, humans began to notice which grasses produced the most seeds and which fields yielded better harvests. The transition from wild gathering to intentional planting was slow but inevitable. Around 1,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, this change began in earnest. People learned to break the seed's dormancy and coax it to grow. They dug shallow furrows in the soil. They planted grains deliberately. They watered and weeded and watched. As they did so, they also developed tools. The mortar and pestle allowed them to grind grain more efficiently. Clay pots offered better storage. Fire pits became more specialized and were slowly shaped into primitive ovens. With time came experimentation, the addition of crushed herbs or ash, the use of different water temperatures, the pressing of dough with stones. Nothing happened quickly. Generations passed between changes. But slowly and steadily, the food we call bread emerged from these repetitive actions. These early bakers may not have called themselves such. They may not have realized the magnitude of what they were doing, but with each mixture and each fire-warmed stone, they were writing the first lines of a history that would stretch across millennia. Their hands were rough and their ingredients were few, but their work laid the foundation for all future civilization. It was not agriculture that made bread possible. It was bread that made agriculture necessary. Once humans understood how to transform grain into something edible and storable, they had a reason to settle. Villages formed near fertile fields. Storage huts became homes. Seasonal camps became permanent communities. The rhythm of life began to follow the cycles of planting and harvest. Bread demanded order. Bread demanded patience. Bread became the quiet center of daily life. Even in its simplest form, bread was a triumph of thought and effort. It required planning and timing. It required knowledge passed down from generation to generation. How long to dry the grain, how finely to grind, how hot the stones should be. These lessons were taught not in words but in repetition, in hands showing hands, in watching and doing, in learning by fire, light, and smoke. In this way, bread became tradition, and tradition became identity. Every tribe and every region developed its own methods and preferences. Some favored coarser grinds. Some shaped their bread into thin discs. Some flavored it with crushed seeds. Others let it ferment naturally as the wild yeasts in the air slowly changed its texture. The result was a world of difference built from the same humble seed. And though these people did not write histories or record recipes, their legacy remains in every culture that still breaks bread today. What began in silence with hands in the earth became one of the most defining aspects of human life. The first grains were more than plants. They were promises. Promises of stability, of nourishment, of continuity, as the fields of wild wheat swayed under ancient skies. They carried with them the scent of something new, something human, something lasting. As the Neolithic era unfolded and human settlements became more stable, the relationship between people and grains deepened in complexity and purpose. No longer were grains merely gathered from wild grasses scattered across the landscape. Instead, they were now deliberately sown, carefully tended, and harvested in repeating seasonal rhythms. This transformation from foraging to farming allowed early humans to observe changes in grain growth, weather patterns, and storage techniques with growing precision. With each passing generation, the act of planting became not just a matter of survival, but a craft built on observation, patience, and ritual. As grains became more central to human existence, so too did the processes by which they were transformed into food. The earliest bread-like foods were still simple, little more than mixtures of crushed grain and water dried into hard cakes or heated on stones. But even these primitive forms began to change as new techniques emerged from everyday repetition. One of the most remarkable developments of the Neolithic period was the slow and accidental discovery of fermentation. Left unattended, a mixture of grain and water would sometimes begin to bubble and expand. At first, this may have been seen as a mistake, something spoiled or ruined. But eventually, someone noticed that this change produced a softer, lighter texture once the mixture was baked. What had once been dense and flat now had air and resilience without knowing the precise science behind it. Early humans had stumbled upon the power of wild yeast. This marked the quiet birth of sourdough. Each time a dough was left to sit, it collected microscopic organisms from the air and from the hands that touched it. These organisms consumed the sugars in the flour and released gases that inflated the dough from within. When baked, the result was something astonishingly different from what had come before. It was still simple, still rough, but now it had depth and structure. It had a crust that gave way to a moist, open crumb. It had flavor that was more than just grain. It had life. The process of fermentation became part of the invisible knowledge, passed down through practice rather than instruction. It was not measured or timed with precision, but rather guided by instinct, by texture, by smell and by feel. A skilled baker in the Neolithic world knew when dough was ready, simply by the way it moved under their fingers, or the way it sounded when pressed. These bakers did not work in isolation. Bread was not a private act, but a communal one. In early settlements, the preparation of dough and baking of loaves took place in shared spaces. Clay ovens were built into walls or into the ground, heated with wood and ashes, and used by many families in turn. The smell of baking bread would drift through the village, marking time as clearly as the rising of the sun or the return of the harvest. Bread was sustenance, yes, but it was also rhythm and ritual. As tools improved, so did the control over ingredients. Mortar and pestles were replaced with grinding stones, allowing finer flour to be produced. Water could be added in more precise quantities. Fire could be harnessed more consistently. This allowed for experimentation, and as communities grew and traded, so too did their knowledge. Techniques spread slowly from one region to another, carried by travelers, wanderers, and chance encounters. With them came new flavors, new shapes, and new customs. In some areas, the S were flattened and baked quickly. In others, they were left to rise for hours. Some communities folded herbs and ash into their bread. Others wrapped dough in leaves or buried it in hot coals. Each method was shaped by local resources and climate, yet all carried the same quiet intention to turn grain into nourishment. The result was not a single type of bread, but a spectrum of forms that reflected the environments and imaginations of those who made them. By the end of the Neolithic period, bread had moved far beyond survival. It had become something cultural, something expressive, something that marked who a people were and how they lived. It was shared at births and burials, in feasts and in famines. It bound the seasons together and gave meaning to the labor of planting, tending, harvesting, and grinding. The journey from seed to sourdough was long and slow, shaped by thousands of hands and countless hours. But it changed not only what humans ate, but how they thought about food and about time. To bake bread was to participate in something larger than the self. It was to become part of a living tradition, one that spoke through fermentation and fire, through patience and repetition. The innovations of the Neolithic age were not sudden or dramatic, but they were profound. They laid the groundwork for everything that followed. In the quiet rise of a sourdough loaf, we can still feel the echoes of that time, the warmth of ancient hands, and the wisdom of forgotten days. In the golden lands along the Nile, where the river breathed life into the desert, and time moved with the flooding of the waters, a new era of bread began to rise. Ancient Egypt was not only a cradle of civilization, but also a cradle of baking. It was here among the reed boats and stone temples that bread took on new complexity and significance, becoming not just food, but culture, religion, and economy. The Egyptians were masterful agriculturalists, and their grains, especially emmer wheat and barley, were grown in abundance along the fertile floodplains. Their harvests were carefully recorded, their storage meticulously planned, and their preparation of bread became one of the most essential acts of daily life. Unlike the flat and dense breads of earlier cultures, Egyptian bakers discovered how to make bread that was light and airy through the controlled use of fermentation. This discovery was likely accidental, perhaps the result of leaving dough to rest too long in the warm Egyptian air. But the result changed the course of baking history. These early leavened breads were made in round or oblong shapes, often with slightly domed tops and a soft interior that had never before been achieved on such a wide scale. Bread was baked in clay ovens, built into walls, or on top of embers, using conical molds or dome-shaped coverings to trap heat. Bakers often used yeast sediment from beer brewing to kickstart the fermentation process. A clever example of the symbiotic relationship between two of Egypt's staple consumables. Beer and bread shared not only ingredients, but also symbolic and economic roles within society. Together, they formed the core rations for workers, including those who built the massive temples and pyramids, whose silhouettes still stand against the Egyptian sky. Payment in bread was not uncommon, and bread was as much currency as sustenance. It was produced in large quantities, often in long communal bakeries that were part of estate complexes, temples, or government buildings. Bread was eaten at every meal, from the simplest breakfasts to elaborate banquets held by the elite. Recipes varied widely, with some loaves enriched with honey dates or spices, while others were purely utilitarian, designed only to fill and sustain. Some breads were shaped like animals or plants for religious ceremonies, while others were deliberately hardened and placed in tombs to accompany the dead. In these cases, bread became eternal food intended to nourish in the afterlife, just as it had in earthly existence. The symbolism of bread was profound. It was offered to gods and spirits, burned in temples, given to the poor, and used to mark the passing of seasons and the rhythms of life. Wall paintings and carvings show scenes of women grinding grain, men kneading dough, and rows of loaves laid out to bake under the sun or inside ovens. These depictions are not only artistic but instructive, offering modern scholars insights into the techniques, tools, and traditions of ancient baking. Bread molds have been found in tombs alongside the loaves they once shaped, some still carrying the imprints of their last use thousands of years ago. The connection between bread and the divine was not metaphorical. In Egypt, it was literal. The god Osiris, associated with death and rebirth, was often linked to grain and harvest. The annual flooding of the Nile, which brought both destruction and renewal, was tied to agricultural cycles and bread production. The act of baking bread echoed the transformation of grain into something life-sustaining, and the rising of dough mirrored the renewal of life. Even hieroglyphics for bread and bakery are among the most common symbols in the written language of the time, reflecting just how integral this food was to all aspects of existence. Egyptian bakers understood not just how to make bread, but how to make it meaningful. Every step of the process, from sowing the grain to shaping the loaf, carried a weight of tradition, intention, and spiritual awareness. They knew that bread was more than just a meal. It was a ritual, a story, a symbol. It connected them to their ancestors, to their gods, and to each other. The legacy of Egyptian bread making continues to influence modern baking. Techniques developed thousands of years ago echo in the rising of every leavened loaf, and the principles of fermentation and oven design explored in antiquity remain foundational even today. To bite into a piece of sourdough or to tear off a chunk of soft leavened bread is to unknowingly follow in the footsteps of the Nile's ancient bakers whose hands shaped flour and water into sustenance for both life and eternity. In the bustling cities and quiet countryside of ancient Greece and Rome, bread evolved into more than nourishment. It became a visible and tangible expression of class, status, and identity. As these civilizations expanded and urbanized, The production and consumption of bread became central not just to diet, but to the very structure of society. In ancient Greece, bread was already a staple food consumed by nearly every household, regardless of wealth or position. But the type and quality of bread differed significantly between classes. The poor often ate coarse barley bread made from roughly ground grains that retained their husks and bran, producing a dense, heavy loaf that was filling but far from refined. The wealthier citizens preferred bread made from finely milled wheat flour, sifted to remove impurities and baked into softer, lighter loaves with golden crusts and tender crumbs. This preference reflected more than taste. It was a statement of refinement and social elevation. In markets across Athens, different types of bread were sold side by side, from humble barley rounds to elaborate loaves studded with honey, sesame, or herbs, each carrying an unspoken message about the one who bought or served it. Bread was no longer just sustenance. It had become a cultural object. Greek literature and philosophy often referenced bread, using it as metaphor or moral lesson, suggesting that bread represented civilization, discipline, and even morality. Baking was also tied to religious practice, with certain breads dedicated to specific gods or used during sacrifices and festivals. Offerings of bread formed part of the dialogue between mortals and the divine, making the act of baking a spiritual as well as domestic endeavor. As Greek influence gave way to Roman dominance, the importance of bread only deepened and its role in public life expanded dramatically. In Rome, bread was not just a household product, but a matter of public policy. The grain dole, or annona, was a government-supported program, providing free or subsidized grain to Roman citizens, particularly those in the lower classes. This grain could be taken home and milled into flour or baked into bread making. It an essential component of daily life and a tool of political control. The phrase bread and circuses is not metaphorical. It refers to the deliberate strategy of keeping the populace content through regular food distributions and public entertainment. The Roman state recognized the power of bread to maintain peace and loyalty. With an expanding empire came an expanding need for efficiency in baking. Large public bakeries were constructed throughout the city, operated by slaves or freedmen under government oversight. These bakeries could produce hundreds or thousands of loaves per day using massive wood-fired ovens and standardized molds. Bread began to take on regulated forms. Flat, round, oval, long, each shape associated with different regions or purposes. Some loaves were scored before baking to allow for easier breaking. Others were stamped with marks or symbols to identify their origin or quality. Wealthy Romans enjoyed access to exotic ingredients like imported flour, milk, eggs, and sweeteners, allowing them to commission luxurious breads flavored with spices, fruits, and nuts. These loaves were often presented as part of banquets or celebrations, showcasing the generosity and sophistication of the host. In contrast, the bread of the poor remained simple, sometimes little more than a baked paste of water and grain. The contrast between the classes was not just visible on the plate. It was experienced daily in taste, texture, and aroma. Roman writers such as Pliny the Elder and Juvenal commented on bread, frequently noting its significance in daily life and its implications for health, morality, and society. Bread was also linked to labor, with certain professions such as soldiers, builders, and laborers receiving regular bread rations as part of their compensation. The act of breaking bread was both literal and symbolic, signifying community, unity, and obligation. Bakers in Rome were organized into guilds and held a respected, if modest, position in the urban hierarchy. Their work was essential and tightly controlled, subject to price regulations and inspections. Some bakeries became family businesses passed from parent to child, maintaining recipes and traditions over generations. Excavations in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum have revealed entire bakeries preserved under volcanic ash, including mills, ovens, kneading troughs, and carbonized loaves still bearing the marks of their molds. These archaeological sites offer an intimate glimpse into the rhythm of Roman baking. The labor, the heat, the smell of flour and fire. Through these details, we understand that bread was not only food, it was infrastructure. It held the city together. It moved with soldiers across borders. It fed slaves in fields and senators in marble halls. It was shaped by politics, but also shaped them in return. To live in the Greco-Roman world was to live with bread at the center of existence. It fed the belly, yes, but also the mind, the culture, and the economy. Whether eaten in a humble home or at a lavish feast, bread revealed who you were, where you came from, and what place you held in the grand machinery of empire. As the grandeur of ancient empires faded into the fragmented kingdoms and feudal systems of medieval Europe, the role of bread shifted from a mark of cultural identity to a harsh reflection of survival. The people of this period lived under the constant pressure of unstable harvests, unpredictable weather, and political upheaval, all of which affected the availability of grain and the quality of bread that could be produced. In cities, villages, and scattered hamlets, bread remained the most important staple in the daily diet of nearly every person, regardless of class. But the types of bread consumed diverged sharply along economic lines. The poor ate dark, heavy loaves made from rye, barley, or oats, often mixed with legumes, chestnut flour, or ground acorns to stretch supplies. These breads were dense, coarse, and sometimes bitter, and they were frequently prepared in haste, or with ingredients that were partially spoiled due to lack of proper storage. In extreme cases, famine bread emerged from desperation, containing fillers like straw bark or ground-up weeds, which gave some sense of fullness, but offered little nourishment. Meanwhile, the nobility enjoyed white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour called pain demi or manchet, depending on the region. These loaves were light in color, soft in texture, and symbols of both wealth and refinement. Unlike the dark loaves of the poor, which were baked in shared village ovens or directly on hearthstones, noble breads were prepared in private kitchens by skilled cooks and served in carved pieces as trenchers to hold meats and sauces at banquets. The contrast was not just culinary. It was emblematic of the vast divide between those who ruled and those who worked the land. For the peasantry, the act of baking bread was a collective one, often tied to the rhythms of communal life. Most villagers did not have ovens in their homes and instead brought their prepared dough to a central bakehouse where it was baked alongside the loaves of their neighbors. This bakehouse was overseen by the local lord or monastery, which often charged a fee or demanded a portion of the baked loaves in exchange for access to the oven. These arrangements were codified in local customs and charters, binding the villagers to obligations that extended beyond flour and fire. Bread became an instrument of control as well as sustenance. Monasteries played a significant role in both the development of bread making and the preservation of baking traditions during this period. Monks were often among the most literate and disciplined members of society, and their knowledge of agriculture, brewing, and baking allowed them to refine techniques passed down from earlier times. Within the stone walls of these religious communities, bread took on sacred dimensions, serving not only as food for the body, but as a symbol of spiritual life. The Eucharistic bread used in Christian rituals was baked according to strict formulas and rituals, and the care with which it was prepared reflected the reverence given to the idea of bread as the body of Christ. For the lay population, bread remained more practical, but it was no less central to daily life. Festivals, fasts, and religious observances influenced when and how bread could be eaten. During Lent, for instance, rich breads with eggs and dairy were avoided, and simpler loaves were consumed instead. On feast days, spiced or sweetened breads made rare appearances, often infused with fruits or nuts and baked into symbolic shapes. These occasions were treasured not just for their religious meaning, but for the momentary escape they offered from the monotony and difficulty of daily eating. Despite the hardships of the time, bread remained an anchor. It was the first food eaten in the morning and often the last before bed. It was carried to the fields wrapped in cloth or dipped into thin soups at the table. It was traded for favors offered as gifts or used to feed animals in lean times. It marked the rhythms of the seasons and the toil of the land. The process of making bread, from grinding the grain to shaping the dough, was physically demanding and time-consuming, but it connected each person to a cycle larger than themselves. It was work that linked families to the soil and to each other. Even in scarcity, bread was a source of identity and pride. Each village had its preferred methods, flavors, and rituals, and these were passed down through generations, sometimes unchanged for centuries. The scent of baking bread in a medieval village was more than a promise of nourishment. It was a sign of endurance. In the flickering light of a thatched bakehouse or the cool shade of a monastic kitchen, bread continued to rise, carrying with it the quiet resilience of a people who faced uncertainty, hunger, and hardship, yet continued to knead, to bake, to share, and to survive. With the arrival of the Renaissance, a period marked by intellectual rebirth, artistic flourishing, and technological progress, the world of bread also began to transform in subtle but meaningful ways. In the great cities of Florence, Venice, and Paris, the cultural and scientific advancements of the era began to touch even the most ordinary aspects of daily life, including the preparation of flour and the refinement of baking techniques. As wealth grew and trade expanded across Europe, the appetite for finer, more delicate bread increased, particularly among the upper classes who now saw food not just as sustenance, but as a form of sophistication, status, and beauty. The heart of this transformation lay in the mill where the grinding of grain had been taking place for thousands of years, but which now became subject to invention and innovation. Watermills and windmills became more efficient with improved gears and grinding stones, allowing millers to separate bran and germ from the endosperm more thoroughly. This produced flour that was whiter, softer, and more consistent than anything available in the medieval period. This whiteness came to symbolize purity and wealth, since it required extra processing and resulted in lower yields, making it more expensive and exclusive. Bread made from this refined flour was light in color and texture, a sharp contrast to the dark, dense loaves still consumed by the poor. Among the elite, white bread became a statement of elegance and civility. It was often shaped with care, decorated with intricate scoring, or molded into artistic forms that reflected the Renaissance ideal of beauty and order. Bakers began experimenting with enriched doughs, adding buttermilk, sugar, or eggs to create softer, more indulgent breads, suitable for feasts and courtly gatherings. These enriched breads were no longer just food, but expressions of taste and power served in banquet halls, on silver platters, beside spiced wines, roasted meats, and golden candied fruits. In royal courts and noble households, bread was part of performance, a detail in the choreography of wealth and refinement. The rise of cookbooks and written culinary texts during this era also contributed to the evolution of bread. Recipes were recorded, preserved, and shared across regions and generations, allowing techniques to spread more quickly than ever before. These early books written in Latin, Italian, French, or Spanish detailed not only how to bake bread, but how to present it, how to serve it, and what it meant to offer it to a guest. This formalization of baking knowledge marked a turning point from oral tradition to structured instruction, reflecting the Renaissance desire to catalogue and elevate all aspects of human activity. Yet even as refinement spread, the divide between classes remained stark. The poor still relied on coarser grains, sometimes adulterated with fillers and baked in communal ovens with whatever fuel was available. Their bread was essential, unadorned, and often accompanied by hardship. In contrast, the bread of the rich spoke of leisure, abundance, and deliberate craftsmanship. These parallel realities existed side by side with the elegance of the Renaissance bakery, casting a long shadow over the struggle for daily bread that continued in villages and tenements. In religious life, bread retained its sacred role. But even here, the Renaissance left its mark. Churches and monasteries refined the production of communion. Wafers using specially-made irons and precise mixtures to produce thin round discs with embossed symbols. These wafers represented continuity with earlier Christian traditions, but also reflected the Renaissance interest in geometry, symbolism, and order. Bread served not only the stomach and the senses, but also the soul, continuing to link the divine with the everyday. In cities, bakers began to form early guilds, which regulated training prices and quality and helped establish baking as a respected profession. These guilds provided apprenticeships, formal instruction, and community support, giving rise to bakeries that were no longer simply places of necessity, but spaces of pride, identity, and artistry. Some bakers achieved regional fame for their loaves, their ovens glowing through the night as they fed a growing population with rising expectations. The Renaissance was not an age of radical reinvention in baking, but rather one of refinement, documentation, and elevation. It brought attention to detail, to texture, to flavor, and to the aesthetic of bread. A simple round loaf was now something to be examined, admired, and compared. Every cut, every fold, every crust told a story of the hand that shaped it and the mind that imagined it. The warmth of the oven became a metaphor for creativity. The smell of fresh bread, a reminder that beauty and nourishment could coexist. As Renaissance ideals of balance, harmony, and expression touched architecture, painting, music, and science, they also quietly transformed the loaf of bread, turning it from mere food into a quiet art form whose influence continues to rise to this day. As the Industrial Revolution swept across Europe and North America, it carried with it a wave of change that would touch every aspect of daily life, including the quiet, ancient craft of bread making. What had once been the domain of hands and hearths began to shift into the realm of machines, factories, and mass production. The comforting rhythms of kneading, rising, and baking, which had remained largely unchanged for millennia, were now reimagined in the language of efficiency, speed, and scale. At the heart of this transformation was the mill. The old water wheels and grinding stones of earlier centuries were replaced with steel rollers that crushed grain. more quickly and more finely than ever before. These roller mills separated the bran and germ from the endoperm with remarkable precision, producing refined white flour that was consistent in texture and appearance. This flour became the standard for industrial bread-making baking, prized for its purity, shelf stability, and ability to create light, airy loaves that appealed to modern urban palates. As flour production increased, so too did the demand for large-scale baking facilities. Bakeries, once small local operations serving individual neighborhoods or villages, began to grow into mechanized centers capable of producing thousands of loaves each day. Steam-powered ovens replaced wood-fired hearths, allowing bakers to control temperature and timing with greater accuracy. Mixing and kneading, which had long relied on muscle memory and physical strength, were handed over to mechanical arms that worked tirelessly without rest. Dough was divided and shaped by machines proofed in carefully monitored chambers and baked in long continuous ovens that moved loaves along conveyor belts like items on an assembly line. This mechanization did not simply change how bread was made. It changed how people thought about bread. No longer a handmade artifact, unique to the baker's touch, the loaf of bread became a product engineered for uniformity and convenience. Wrapped in paper, stamped with brand names, and stacked on grocery store shelves, it was now something to be purchased with little thought and consumed without ceremony. Bread became a symbol of modern life, dependable, efficient, and affordable. In cities where populations swelled and time was short, factory bread offered a solution to the demands of fast-paced living. Housewives no longer had to wake early to knead dough or tend to fires. Workers could carry a slice of bread in their lunch pail, knowing it would last through the day. Children ate sandwiches made with soft white slices, crustless and clean, perfect for small hands. Bread was still central, but it had become quiet background nourishment, part of the machinery of daily life. With the rise of industrial bakeries came changes in ingredients as well. Chemical leavening agents and preservatives were introduced to speed up fermentation and extend shelf life. Additives improved texture, appearance, and resistance to mold. While these innovations made bread more accessible, they also altered its flavor and structure. The tang of natural fermentation gave way to a bland sweetness. The irregular bubbles of sourdough and hearthbreads were replaced by tight, even crumbs. Bread was no longer alive in the same way it had once been. It was stable, predictable, and inert. The public embraced these changes, at first seeing them as signs of progress and cleanliness. White bread, in particular, became associated with health, modernity, and social aspiration. To serve white bread was to show that one had moved beyond the struggles of earlier generations. Advertisements praised its purity, its softness, its factory-sealed safety. Schools, hospitals, and military units standardized its use, making it a shared experience across entire nations. Yet, not everyone welcomed this transformation. Some bakers lamented the loss of craftsmanship. Some nutritionists raised concerns about the removal of fiber and nutrients in white flour, and some members of the public missed the hearty flavor and texture of traditional loaves. Small-scale bakers struggled to compete with the low prices and consistent output of industrial bread. The Industrial Revolution had created abundance, but it had also created distance. The consumer no longer saw the flour-dusted hands, the slow bubbling of dough, or the flicker of flame inside an oven. Bread had become faceless and nameless, a product of process rather than place. Still, it persisted, feeding millions day after day loaf after loaf. It filled lunchboxes and lined pantries. It stood beside soup and meat and jam. It was sliced, wrapped, frozen, toasted, and served. In its new form, it continued to do what it had always done: nourish, sustain, and connect. But its connection now was to a system, not a story, to a network, not a neighborhood. The bread of the industrial age was not better or worse than what came before. It was simply different, shaped by the machines and momentum of its time. A reflection of humanity's endless desire to do more, to do faster, and to do bigger. In the hum of engines and the hiss of steam, the loaf evolved once more into something familiar, yet transformed a soft, silent companion to the modern world. As the 20th century unfolded, bread underwent yet another transformation, this time shaped not by scarcity or survival, but by the rising influence of convenience, industry, and the changing pace of modern life. What had once been a handmade staple passed from hearth to table began to evolve into a highly engineered product designed for shelf life, softness, uniformity, and speed. The steady march of industrialization that had begun in the previous century now reached full momentum, and with it came a new wave of food science, packaging, innovation, and consumer culture that would reshape the identity of bread for generations. One of the most defining moments in this transformation occurred in 1928, when a small bakery in Missouri introduced the first pre-sliced loaf of bread using a mechanical bread slicer designed by Otto Frederick Roeder. This invention initially met with skepticism but quickly captivated the public, as it offered a level of convenience previously unimaginable. No longer did households need to cut each slice by hand or worry about uneven portions. The phrase, "the greatest thing since sliced bread," emerged not as a joke, but as a genuine reflection of the product's perceived brilliance. Sliced bread was soft, easy to store, and ready for sandwiches, toast, and snacks at a moment's notice. It symbolized modernity and progress, and its rapid adoption across the United States and beyond marked the beginning of a new era in mass-consumed food. Alongside this shift came the rise of large commercial bread brands, each competing to create the softest, whitest, and longest-lasting loaf. Preservatives, emulsifiers, and bleaching agents became common ingredients in factory bread, as bakers sought to extend shelf life, maintain texture, and prevent mold. Enriched flour was introduced to replace nutrients lost during processing, resulting in the addition of vitamins such as niacin, riboflavin, thiamine, and iron. These additives were often promoted as health benefits, and in some cases became part of public nutrition policy aimed at preventing deficiencies among the growing urban population. Bread now came in plastic bags, sealed with twist ties or metal clips, and stamped with expiration dates and branding. Grocery stores displayed dozens of varieties on their shelves, each wrapped in bright colors and promising flavor, softness, and purity. The experience of bread had become standardized, predictable, and streamlined to fit into the routines of busy families and working adults. Home baking began to decline as factory bread proved faster, cheaper, and more convenient. In schools, cafeterias, hospitals, and military bases, white sandwich bread became the default, a silent companion to peanut butter jelly, ham and cheese, or butter and jam. Its neutral flavor, soft texture, and consistent size made it an ideal canvas for countless meals. Advertising played a key role in shaping public perception of bread. During this time, brands used imagery of smiling children, wholesome mothers, and gleaming kitchens to associate their products with cleanliness, comfort, and domestic bliss. Bread became a symbol of American prosperity and post-war optimism. Commercial jingles, slogans, and television commercials reinforced the idea that soft white bread was not only convenient, but essential to a happy modern life. Yet, as the century progressed, a quiet undercurrent of resistance began to emerge. Some began to question the nutritional value of factory bread, particularly the highly processed white loaves, stripped of fiber and natural grain components. Health-conscious consumers sought alternatives, looking for whole wheat sourdough or multigrain options that retained more of the original grain structure. Artisanal bakers began to reappear in urban centers, offering hand-shaped loaves with crackling crusts and complex flavors produced through long fermentation methods. This return to traditional techniques signaled a small but growing dissatisfaction with industrial bread and a yearning for food that was not only easy but meaningful. In some circles, homemade bread became an act of rebellion against processed foods, a quiet protest against the impersonal nature of mass production. Despite these emerging trends, factory bread remained dominant throughout much of the 20th century, especially in the West. Its presence was ubiquitous in lunchboxes, supermarkets, and pantries, and its role in daily life was rarely questioned. It fed millions and provided consistency in a world that was increasingly fragmented and fast-paced. The 20th century was an age of extremes for bread. It brought both innovation and oversimplification, abundance and homogenization. Bread, which had once reflected local culture, tradition, and craft, was now shaped by marketing strategy, economic pressures, and global supply chains. It no longer told the story of a village or a family, but of a company, a factory, a brand. And yet, in all its forms, it continued to serve its most basic purpose: to feed, to satisfy, and to be present in the quiet moments of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The story of bread in the 20th century is not one of loss, but of transformation. A story shaped by the rhythms of modern life, the hum of machinery, and the pursuit of convenience above all else. As the 20th century drew to a close and the 21st began, a quiet but steady shift emerged in the way people thought about bread. A movement away from industrial uniformity and back to war tradition, craft, and regional identity. This shift did not happen all at once, nor was it driven by a single trend, but rather by a growing awareness among consumers that something had been lost in the age of convenience. The bread that filled supermarket shelves, though soft, consistent, and readily available, had become disconnected from place, from people, and from purpose. It had lost the complexity of flavor, the depth of process, and the sense of care that had once defined it. In response to this disconnection, a revival of artisan bread making began to rise. Slowly at first in scattered bakeries and food communities, and then more visibly as chefs, writers, and enthusiasts began to champion the values of slow fermentation, whole grains, local sourcing, and handcrafts. These values stood in contrast to the industrial model of bread production, which prized efficiency over nuance and uniformity over character. The artisan movement instead embraced variation, imperfection, and time-sync. Bread not just as a commodity, but as an expression of place, culture, and human touch. Sourdough became the emblem of this revival. A bread whose fermentation is guided not by commercial yeast, but by wild microbes that live in flour, water, and air. Each sourdough starter develops its own flavor profile influenced by climate, ingredients, and care. And each loaf made from it becomes a unique reflection of those conditions. The act of making sourdough requires patience and attention. The dough must be folded and rested, shaped and proofed, baked with intuition and skill. There is no shortcut, and in this slowness, many people found meaning, a kind of resistance to the speed and sameness of modern life. Alongside the rise of artisan techniques came a renewed interest in heritage grains and traditional flours. Farmers and millers began to reintroduce ancient varieties of wheat such as iron, emmer, and each offering different flavors, textures, and nutritional qualities. These grains were often grown organically or regeneratively, supporting biodiversity and soil health, while providing bakers with ingredients that connected them to agricultural histories, often forgotten. Milling too became a point of focus with stone-ground flour, regaining popularity for its texture and its ability to retain oils and nutrients, often stripped away in roller milling around the world. This return to tradition was not confined to Europe or North America, but reflected a broader, global awakening to the diversity and richness of bread cultures. In India, flatbreads like roti and chapati continued to be rolled and cooked on hot stones, passed from mothers to children with practiced hands. In the Middle East, pita and lefa remained central to meals, soft, warm, and ready to cradle spiced meats and vegetables. In Ethiopia, ingora continued to serve not just as bread, but as plate utensil and shared space. A sour fermented pancake made from tay grain, layered with both flavor and cultural meaning. In Mexico, tortillas persisted as daily staples, pressed by hand or machine from corn masa and grilled to accompany stews and beans. In France, crusty baguettes lined bakery windows, their crackling crusts, a sound of morning routine. In Germany, dark, dense rye breads carried the deep temps of long fermentation. In Italy, ciabatta and focaccia offered airy softness or oily crispness, depending on the region. In Japan, milk bread, known as shakopan, became a canvas of subtle sweetness and pillowy softness. This diversity was not new, but it became newly visible as globalization allowed for greater cultural exchange and, as individuals, became more curious about the foods of other peoples and places. Travel, television, internet, and migration all played a role in expanding the understanding of what bread could be and where it came from. At the same time, the act of baking bread at home began to experience a renaissance fueled by cookbooks, documentaries, and online communities where people shared techniques, recipes, and photos of golden loaves pulled from home ovens. For some, baking became a form of meditation, a quiet, tactile activity in an increasingly digital world. For others, it was a way to reclaim control over ingredients and nourishment. For many, it was simply joy. The smell of yeast, the feel of dough, the warmth of a crust crackling beneath their fingertips. Bread once more became something to be watched, to be waited for, to be shared. Its transformation from product back to process mirrored a deeper longing for connection, for meaning, and for care. In this new chapter of bread's history, both tradition and innovation exist side by side. Bakers experiment with fermentation techniques, hydration levels, baking surfaces, and scoring patterns while also respecting the wisdom of generations before them. They borrow from cultures near and far, remixing ideas and flavors to reflect the complexity of the world they inhabit. Bread is now both ancient and modern, both humble and refined. It can be bought for cents or crafted for hours. It can be eaten quickly or revered slowly. In all its forms, it reminds us that food is not just about hunger, but about identity, culture, and the invisible thread that connects us all. Throughout human history, bread has not only served as food, but as a symbol, a ritual, a gesture, and a bridge between the earthly and the divine. It has been used to mark births, deaths, unions, separations, harvests, and offerings. And across centuries and continents, bread has carried a weight far greater than its ingredients might suggest. It is simple in form, yet profoundly layered in meaning, and in many traditions, it continues to occupy a sacred space at the intersection of nourishment and spirituality. In Christianity, bread holds a central place both symbolically and literally. The act of breaking bread is rooted in the Last Supper, when Jesus shared bread with his disciples and declared it to be his body given for them. This moment forms the foundation of the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, a ritual repeated daily, weekly, or seasonally, depending on denomination in which bread is blessed, broken, and shared among believers. The bread in this sacrament is not just a representation, but a ritual reenactment that connects the worshipper to the divine. It is eaten in silence, with reverence often accompanied by wine, and it serves as a physical reminder of sacrifice, unity, and renewal. In many churches, the bread is carefully prepared, often in the form of wafers, thin, round, and imprinted with sacred symbols. In others, it is leavened, torn by hand, and passed from one person to the next, symbolizing both community and humility. In Judaism, bread is equally significant and tied deeply to ritual and memory. Challah, the braided bread served on the Sabbath and holidays, is rich with symbolism. Its braid reflects unity, and its sweetness, often enhanced with honey or raisins, is a reminder of the joy and restfulness of Shabbat. Before eating challah, a blessing is recited, acknowledging the source of sustenance and the divine role in providing the harvest. During Passover, a different bread takes center stage. Matzah, an unleavened flatbread that commemorates the haste with which the Israelites left Egypt, unable to let their dough rise. For 8 days, matzah replaces leavened bread in Jewish homes, serving as both a dietary rule and a narrative thread that links present practice to ancient story. Bread is not merely eaten, but remembered. It becomes history held in the hand and tasted with intention. In Islam, bread is considered a gift from God and is treated with respect and gratitude. Wasting bread is discouraged, and in many households, leftover bread is carefully collected and never thrown directly into the trash. During the month of Ramadan, bread often plays a role in both the pre-dawn meal and the evening iftar, where it might be served with dates, soups, or stews. Flatbreads like kubs or naan are common throughout the Muslim world and are often used to scoop food or shared communally on a platter. The act of sharing bread becomes an act of brotherhood, hospitality, and spiritual mindfulness. In Hinduism, bread in the form of chapati, roti, or puri is offered to deities during puja rituals and later consumed as prasad or blessed food. This act of offering transforms the ordinary into the sacred, creating a cycle of giving and receiving that emphasizes the divine presence in everyday life. The bread may be placed before an idol or altar, accompanied by flowers, incense, and chants. And the moment of its return to the devote is one of quiet gratitude. In Buddhism, simplicity and mindfulness are key, and bread, while not a ritual object in itself, is sometimes used in offerings or meals within monastic communities. The preparation and consumption of food, including bread, are seen as acts of awareness. Each bite a chance to be present, to give thanks, and to cultivate compassion. In ancient religions, bread often served as a medium for communication with the gods. In Mesopotamia, loaves were shaped, and offered in temples, burned or buried as part of rites for fertility, harvest, or protection. In Egypt, as discussed earlier, bread accompanied the dead into the afterlife, a provision for eternity. In Greek and Roman ceremonies, bread was placed on altars or shared among priests and celebrants, often as part of a larger feast, honoring the cycles of the earth and the presence of the divine within it. In Slavic folk traditions, loaves were baked with symbols pressed into the crusts and placed under pillows or doorways to ensure health, protection, and prosperity. Bread was woven into marriage ceremonies where a couple might share a loaf as a sign of unity, or into funeral customs, where bread was broken and eaten in memory of the deceased. These practices show that bread was not just sustenance but a vessel of belief, a way to externalize hopes, fears, gratitude, and reverence. In all these contexts, bread transcends its material form. It becomes a ritual object shaped not only by hands, but by meaning. It carries prayers, memories, blessings, and intentions. To bake it is to prepare something sacred. To offer it is to invite connection. To eat it is to remember even today when rituals may be less visible or less frequent. Bread continues to carry symbolic weight. A loaf given to a neighbor, a slice shared with a friend, a table set with bread at its center. These small acts echo the larger traditions from which they spring. Bread reminds us that even the most ordinary things can hold extraordinary meaning when approached with care, presence, and respect. As we look ahead into the uncertain terrain of the future, one of the most quietly significant questions we might ask is what will become of bread. In a world shaped by rapid technological advancement, shifting climates, evolving dietary needs, and ever-changing cultural landscapes, bread remains both a symbol of continuity and a canvas for reinvention. Its history has always been shaped by the times in which it was baked and the people who baked it. And now, in the 21st century, we find ourselves at another turning point. One that may redefine what bread means, how it is made, and who has access to it. Climate change is one of the most pressing challenges to the future of bread, as the grains that form its foundation are deeply dependent on stable growing conditions. Wheat, corn, barley, and rye all require specific temperatures, rainfall patterns, and soil quality to flourish. And as global climates become more erratic, crop yields face growing threats. Droughts, floods, pests, and changing seasons can disrupt not only harvests, but the consistency of flour, leading to price instability and regional shortages. In response, agricultural scientists are working to develop more resilient grain varieties that can withstand extreme weather, require less water, and offer higher nutritional value. These efforts are supported by traditional seed savers who work to preserve biodiversity by cultivating ancient and heritage grains that may hold answers to future challenges. Advances in food science are also opening new frontiers in bread making with research into alternative flours, fermentation techniques, and nutrient fortification. As more people adopt plant-based or gluten-free diets, bakers and scientists alike are exploring flours made from legumes, roots, nuts, seeds, and even insects. These new ingredients can offer different textures, flavors, and nutritional profiles. And while some may never fully replace wheat, others may carve out their own niche in the evolving world of bread. Fermentation, too, is being re-examined not just as a traditional method, but as a living science where microbes are studied, cultivated, and combined with precision to produce specific results in texture, aroma, and shelf life. In this future laboratory, yeast is not simply an ingredient, but a tool for creativity and control. Technology is also reshaping how bread is produced, with automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence beginning to play roles once reserved for human hands. Smart ovens can now adjust temperature and humidity in real time to optimize crust formation and crumb development. Machines can mix, fold, and shape dough with remarkable consistency, allowing for large-scale production without sacrificing artisanal quality. Algorithms can predict consumer demand, manage ingredient inventories, and adjust recipes based on data from weather markets or customer feedback. While some fear that this mechanization may strip bread of its soul, others see it as a way to preserve quality and accessibility in a world where labor shortages and population growth place increasing pressure on food systems. In urban centers where space is limited and populations are dense, new models for bread production are emerging. Micro-bakeries, vertical farms, and subscription-based bread services are offering alternatives to traditional bakeries and supermarkets. These small-scale operations often emphasize local sourcing, transparency, and community engagement, positioning bread not just as food, but as a shared experience. In contrast, some corporations are experimenting with 3D printing of dough and fully automated bakery pods designed to function in airports, office buildings, or remote locations. These innovations suggest a future where bread is available everywhere, always fresh, always tailored, always optimized. Yet, even as we imagine these possibilities, a counter-errand continues to grow, one rooted in slowness, simplicity, and human connection. Home baking has seen a global resurgence, driven in part by moments of crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which reminded many people of the comfort and control found in mixing flour, water, and salt by hand. For some, baking became a ritual, a way to mark time, a grounding act in a disoriented world. This revival has not faded but continues in quiet kitchens, where loaves are shaped in the early morning hours and pulled from ovens with steam and satisfaction. Education about bread is also evolving, with workshops, online classes, and community programs teaching people about grain fermentation, shaping, and baking, not just as techniques, but as cultural practices. These efforts aim to preserve and share the stories behind the loaf, reminding us that bread is not only something we eat, but something we inherit, something we carry forward. In many ways, the future of bread is not singular, but plural. It will be baked in wood-fired ovens and robotic factories in rural villages and bustling metropolises. It will be made from wheat, tay, cassava, chickpeas, or lab-grown starch. It will be braided, flat, crusty, chewy, steamed, seeded, or sweet. It will serve the needs of the hungry, the curious, the nostalgic, and its diversity will reflect our world and its changes. And through it all, bread will continue to do what it has always done: offer warmth, offer sustenance, offer connection. As long as we eat together, as long as we gather around tables, as long as we care about flavor, memory, and meaning, bread will have a place. It may change shape, but not its essence. It may rise differently, but it will still rise. Bread is more than flour, water, salt, and yeast. It is a cultural artifact, a reflection of history, geography, and identity that appears not just on plates, but in stories, rituals, languages, and everyday life. Across the globe, each region has developed its own approach to bread, its own textures, shapes, flavors, and meanings, all shaped by the land, climate, customs, and values of the people who bake and eat it. In this way, bread becomes a form of cultural expression encoded with knowledge and memory passed down not only through recipes, but through gestures, sounds, smells, and traditions. In France, the baguette is not merely a loaf, but a symbol of national pride, a daily staple with its own laws and protected status. Baguettes are long, crisp, and golden, their crackling crusts echoing through narrow streets and boulangeries where bakers begin their work before dawn. The act of carrying one under the arm or placing it on the dinner table is so embedded in daily life that it defines not just eating habits, but an entire rhythm of living. In Italy, bread varies dramatically from region to region, each loaf carrying the story of its local soil and social customs. In the north, soft milk-enriched panini are favored, while in the south, dense, chewy loaves of semolina rise in wood-fired ovens, often used to scoop up sauces or hold slices of cured meats. In some areas, unsalted bread is traditional, a legacy of historic taxes on salt. Each region claims its bread as part of its culinary dialect, a language of flour that binds communities together. In Mexico, tortillas made from nixtamalized corn are more than bread. They are history pressed into rounds on coma. They hold the food and tell the story of maize as a sacred crop. Tortillas are made by hand passed between generations, their preparation tied to both everyday meals and ceremonial feasts. Their circular shape and warm pliability reflect the importance of sharing and the continuity of indigenous foodways in Ethiopia. Injera is more than a side dish. It is the foundation of a meal both literal and cultural made from tay, a tiny ancient grain. Injera is a sour fermented flatbread with a porous texture, perfect for scooping lentils, stews, and vegetables. Meals are served on large rounds of injera, placed at the center of the table, meant to be eaten communally with hands, each person sharing not only the food, but the space and the moment. In India, chapati and roti are present in millions of homes each day. Simple round flatbreads, cooked quickly on hot grails and puffed to soft perfection. These breads are part of the everyday, but they are also personal, tied to the care and rhythm of the kitchen. They represent nourishment, but also connection. As family members gather around and dip them into daz curries or vegetables. In the Middle East, pita bread with its pocket and softness carries layers of meaning in its folds. It is a vessel for flavors, a companion to grilled meats and tangy yogurt, a participant in street food and sacred meals alike. It is both common and essential, tied to hospitality, to generosity, to the warmth of shared meals in courtyards, kitchens, and street corners. In China, steamed buns like mantou serve as daily staples, offering a soft, mild bread, often filled with meat or vegetables, or served plain alongside rice dishes. These buns speak to balance, simplicity, and precision, part of a culinary tradition that values texture and temperature as much as taste. In Jewish communities, challah, braided and glossy, is baked for Shabbat, its shape and shine reflecting beauty, rest, and blessing. In Slavic cultures, breads like paska and kulich are baked for Easter with elaborate decorations, sometimes marked with crosses or religious initials, and brought to church to be blessed. In Eastern Europe, rye bread is often sour, dense, and dark. Its tanginess, matched by its history as a companion to hardship, resilience, and resourcefulness. In the Caribbean and West Africa, breads made from cassava or plantain represent adaptations to climate and colonization, reshaping local ingredients into forms that meet both necessity and tradition. Every one of these examples tells us something about place, about people, about how survival becomes ritual, and how ritual becomes culture. Bread serves not only to feed, but to remind. It connects the past to the present, the soil to the kitchen, the hands of ancestors to the mouths of children. It appears in songs, in sayings, in ceremonies, and in the daily acts that give life, rhythm, and shape. To eat the bread of a place is to enter its culture, to receive something more than calories, to taste history, belonging, and story. Bread becomes a form of identity, edible and ever-present, speaking of who we are, where we come from, and how we choose to nourish ourselves and each. And so concludes the bread's magnificent and nourishing journey, stretching from the black sands of Jordan to our modern tables. Thanks to the millennia of patience and the desire to share the world's bounty hidden within a loaf of bread, our lives have found meaning. We have learned that bread is not merely a foodstuff, but the first and most solid brick upon which civilization is built. Take care of yourselves until our next journey.